Hello and welcome to Middle East Matters. I'm Julia Kim. Coming up on the show this week, Lebanon's new cabinet holds its first meeting to discuss ways to kickstart an economic recovery. The country is facing its worst financial crisis in over a century. An alarming rise in coronavirus cases in Syria's Idlib province. The new wave, driven by the Delta variant, comes as government forces step up airstrikes in the area. And move over Cairo. More than 1,000 years later, Egypt is to get a new capital city. Al-Masr is the pet project of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, but its construction has been complicated by the pandemic. But first, after a 13-month political vacuum, Lebanon's new government has held its first cabinet meeting. It's hoping to pull the country out of its worst economic crisis in over a century. This lineup of ministers replaces a caretaker administration that had quit after last year's massive explosion in Beirut. But many Lebanese are doubtful their new leaders are up to the task. Brian Quinn has the story.
Lebanon's new government meeting for the first time. They now face the unenviable task of ending what the World Bank is calling one of the world's worst economic crises since the mid-19th century. The Lebanese pound has lost more than 90% of its value against the dollar. With inflation spiraling, some 80% of Lebanese citizens have been driven into poverty. Shortages of gasoline and medicine are now common, with electricity only available for 2 hours a day. Analysts say that before any recovery can take place, the new government must first stop the bleeding.
This government doesn't need to create miracles. It just needs to stop the financial collapse as soon as possible, to stop people's livelihoods from deteriorating. That's all.
Key to halting the freefall will be new talks with the International Monetary Fund to unlock billions of dollars in aid after a historic debt default in March 2020. The Lebanese Finance Ministry now says around $1.1 billion in IMF aid has been approved, with President Michel Aoun calling for a resumption in negotiations. Most international donors, though, are demanding major banking reforms and an audit of the country's financial system before committing more money. While Monday's meeting marks the end of 13 months of political deadlock, many worry that the new government represents just a continuation of the same fractured clientelist system that has allowed the country's political class to perpetuate itself since the 1990s at the expense of the Lebanese people.
Well, we turn next to the Syrian province of Idlib, one of the last remaining rebel strongholds in the country's north. It's experiencing a new wave of COVID infections driven by the more contagious Delta variant. This comes roughly 2 weeks after Syrian refugees in Turkey were allowed to visit relatives in the enclave for the Eid al-Adha holiday. What's more, bombings by government forces have intensified in recent months, putting local hospitals under pressure. Yuka Roya reports.
Hospital beds are filling up in Idlib. Although COVID-19 cases had stabilised earlier this year, infections have been on the rise again since mid-August. A week ago, more than 1,500 new cases were recorded in a single day, up from several dozen just a few months ago.
Hospitals treating COVID-19 cases are operating at full capacity and isolation centers are more than 80% occupied. On top of that, oxygen tanks and medicines are in short supply.
Understaffed, hospitals are struggling to cope with the more rapid spread of the disease, driven by the Delta variant. Only 1% of the region's population has been vaccinated against COVID-19. Rising violence is exacerbating the situation. Despite an internationally brokered ceasefire agreed in March of last year, government forces backed by Russia have stepped up a military campaign in Idlib, the last major bastion of rebel forces in northern Syria. Last week, an airstrike destroyed a clinic in the village of Maryam, as well as civilian homes on the outskirts of Idlib city. About 3.5 million people live in the region, around 2/3 of them displaced from elsewhere in Syria. Trapped in an enclave controlled by the al-Qaeda-linked jihadist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the vast majority of civilians live in extreme poverty and are dependent on UN aid.
Well, this week, an Israeli prime minister made the first official visit to Egypt in over a decade. Naftali Bennett and Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi discussed ways to revive the long-stalled Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Now, Cairo is pegged to play a key role in a plan devised by Israel's Foreign Affairs Minister Yair Lapid. His proposal: improve the living conditions of Palestinians in Gaza in exchange for calm from Hamas. James Mulholland tells us more.
A statement from Israel's foreign minister.
For too long, the only two options have been either the conquest of Gaza or an endless cycle of violence. Both are bad options.
So Yair Lapid has a third option in mind, a development plan for Gaza.
The formula is simple, and Prime Minister Bennett has already outlined it. In exchange for calm, we are ready to give much more than before.
The foreign minister put forward a plan in two phases. First, repairing the power lines in the Gaza Strip, connecting the gas and building a water desalination plant. In exchange, Hamas must commit to long-term calm or face reprisals. Second, the construction of a port in Gaza and a link by road between the Strip and the West Bank, which is separated by Israeli territory. Since 2008, there have been 4 wars between Hamas and Israel in Gaza, the last one in May, resulting in 260 Palestinian deaths and 13 on the Israeli side. The reconstruction of the Gaza Strip is behind schedule, and financial aid sent to the territory by Qatar has been blocked by the Israeli government since the last conflict, leading to demonstrations like this one less than a fortnight ago. Yair Lapid said Egypt could act as an intermediary between Hamas and the Jewish state, while the plan would also include European and Emirati funding. The plan is still at the proposal stage. It still has to be approved by the Israeli coalition government.
Well, in a surprise breakthrough, Iran has agreed to allow the International Atomic Energy Agency to serve as cameras used to monitor nuclear sites in the country. The move has been hailed as a small victory after Tehran had blocked access to the cameras. Well, talks in Vienna over Iran's nuclear deal remain deadlocked, but supporters say Sunday's deal is a step in the right direction. Fraser Jackson with this.
Landing back in Vienna after his trip to Tehran, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency expressed his happiness that the watchdog will be able to service monitoring equipment inside Iran's nuclear facilities.
We will be able to keep the information needed to maintain continuity of knowledge.
A few hours earlier, Rafael Grossi had arrived in Iran during a tense moment. Last December, Tehran restricted IAEA access to its nuclear facilities and put the video filmed inside them under embargo. On Tuesday, the agency published a report denouncing Iran's decision to hinder the IAEA's ability to monitor the country's nuclear program. The deal reached on Sunday still doesn't allow the UN agency to view the footage, but it ensures that the footage exists and that it will be properly stored. Iran's regional foe, Israel, said the agreement was just another ploy by Iran to disguise its nuclear ambitions.
I call on the world powers not to be fooled by the Iranian smokescreen, which will lead to further concessions.
If the US and Iran manage to relaunch the 2015 nuclear agreement, then Tehran would have to give up the footage to the IAEA. But the EU-backed talks have been at a standstill since June, and their resumption date remains unknown.
And finally, what do you do when a capital city runs out of space? Well, other cities usually expand outwards into the suburbs. But Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has chosen instead to build a brand new city. The new administrative capital, Al-Masa, is being built in the middle of the desert, some 35 kilometers from the ancient capital, Cairo. Emerald Maxwell has the story.
It rises up in the desert like a mirage. The 385-metre tall tower, the highest in Africa, is going up in the heart of the business district of the new Egyptian capital. It's been built by more than 8,000 construction workers, led by engineers and Chinese managers, China being the main backer of this new financial centre. With its 80 floors, the tower is designed to be the symbol of an Egypt looking firmly towards the future.
This is the future of Egypt, and it will affect the entire region. It created a revival of the Egyptian economy. If we hadn't done that, we would probably be having a lot of unemployment and economic stagnation.
The man behind the gargantuan project is Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. The colossal site includes a new parliament, ministries, a presidential palace, an international airport, schools and universities, hospitals, places of worship, and space to house more than 6 million people. All of this over 700 square kilometres. That's 7 times the size of Paris. The total is expected to cost 45 billion euros, and the project's been led by the army, under orders from the former general president. The aim is officially to relieve an overpopulated Cairo of some of its 25 million inhabitants and its eternal suffocating congestion. Workers have come from all over Egypt to build the new city, some 35 kilometres east of Cairo, halfway to the Suez Canal. These men are from the centre of the country. They fled the rural poverty there with the hope of earning enough to feed their families.
In my region, there's much less work, nothing on this scale, and I earn far less at home than what we can earn here.
Workers' salaries range from 250 to 300 euros a month, 20 to 30% more than the national average, but it's still not nearly enough to imagine living in this new city.
We spend everything we earn. Egypt's cost of living is way too high for us.
According to official figures, 29% of the population, or more than 30 million people, live below the poverty line. With prices ranging from 300,000 to 1 million euros, these Italian-style villas being built here are out of reach of all but the most privileged. The developer, though, says that of the 1,000 planned homes, over 2/3 have already found buyers.
Our clients know that the new capital's infrastructure and services will be the best in the country. They want the best quality of life and are convinced that they will find that by leaving Cairo to move here.
But there's still a long way to go from his vision. New residents will not be able to move into this affluent neighbourhood until the end of 2022 at best. Works are behind schedule, and the pandemic hasn't helped. With income from the vital tourism industry having dried up, heavily indebted Egypt will have to wait still longer until the big move.
Well, that's it for this edition of Middle East Matters. Stay tuned for the latest world news updates up next.